Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here to speak at this very important event. I will be giving two talks today. The first talk in the morning focuses on habits and neuropsychological mechanisms underlying behavioral addictions. I have a listing of disclosures with respect to relationships with pharmaceutical, gambling, gaming, legal, healthcare, and nonprofit entities. And so I thought I'd start this presentation regarding behavioral addictions in the context of some of the changes that have occurred over the past 10 to 15 years, particularly in the ways in which the main nomenclature systems, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the International Classification of Diseases, how these entities have conceptualized addictions. So this article, these screenshots from the article in Time magazine were printed about a year before the DSM-5 was released. And the article was titled "What Counts as Crazy," and it discussed how DSM-5 was reconsidering some conditions. And one of the images from that article asked, what is the new abnormal? And the three examples that they gave all represented behaviors that could be conceptualized within an addiction framework. So as I mentioned, the two main nomenclature systems are the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that focuses on psychiatric conditions and is generated by the American Psychiatric Association. And then the World Health Organization generates the International Classification of Diseases, which is now in its 11th revision, which came out subsequent to DSM-5. And so if we think about the history of behavioral addictions in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, although the category of non-substance related addictive disorders is new to the DSM-5, the main clinical diagnosis that is in that category is not, and that is gambling disorder. And this was introduced back in 1980 in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And going from DSM-4 to DSM-5, there were committees and work groups that wanted to understand if new data that had been generated would support the classification of gambling disorder as an impulse control disorder not elsewhere specified, or whether some of the competing theories of whether gambling disorder represented an obsessive compulsive spectrum disorder or an addiction without the drug. What did the data show, and would that support the reclassification of gambling disorder? So those changes to DSM-5 research work groups, one focusing on substance use disorders and the other on obsessive compulsive spectrum disorders, the data were reviewed to look at the similarities between gambling disorder and substance use disorders, as well as gambling disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. And this prompted the reclassification in DSM-5. So what were some of the factors that underlie the reclassification of gambling disorder as an addictive disorder? Some of the relationships between gambling disorder and substance use disorders are reflected in the high rates of co-occurrence, which I think we may hear about later today in other presentations. There are similarities in terms of the clinical courses, where there are high rates in adolescents and young adults and lower rates in older adults, as well as some gender-related differences that I'll talk about later today. There are similarities in terms of the clinical characteristics, some of which are reflected in the diagnostic criteria, including aspects of withdrawal, tolerance, interference in major areas of life functioning, repeated unsuccessful attempts to cut back or quit, as well as some that are now specified for substance use disorders, not for gambling disorder, but are still clinically relevant. for example, urges or cravings that are common to both conditions and are often the focus of interventions. And then there are similarities in the biologies, which I'll talk a bit about, that may then underlie some of the similarities in treatments for people, both with respect to self-help interventions, like the 12-step groups, behavioral interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational interviewing, as well as some pharmacotherapies and nutraceuticals, although there are no medications that have regulatory approval for the treatment of gambling disorder. So what are some of the biological similarities? Arguably, some of the strongest data come from functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, fMRI studies, and the slide shows 3 images on the left, 1 on the right. The 3 images on the left are taken from a meta-analysis by Marc Potenza and colleagues. And these are data from a reward processing task, the monetary incentive delay task, looking at the anticipatory phase of reward processing. And what's shown in this bluish area here is that individuals with addictive disorders, both substance use and gambling disorders, show relatively blunted activation of the striatum, brain region implicated in reward processing, on the monetary incentive delay task. Another study focusing on internet gaming disorder shows a similar pattern of blunted activation during reward processing, but using a different task. So I mentioned internet gaming disorder, and internet gaming disorder was considered by the substance use disorder work group in the DSM-5 processes. It was included in Section 3, the non-clinical section, the research section, because it was felt that this was an important entity, but there were insufficient data to include it as a formal clinical diagnosis in DSM-5. And so I think this was helpful, but may put clinicians at a relative deficit in trying to help people. For research purposes, it has allowed for the gathering of more consistent data across jurisdictions, because at the time, the prevalence estimates of internet gaming disorder range from anywhere from less than 1% to over 50%. So having official criteria has allowed for there to be more consistency with the prevalence estimates being about 3%, with some jurisdictions like Asia showing higher prevalence estimates. Now, also importantly, the committee felt that the most data at the time, and this was now back 15 or so years, the most relevant data for health impact were regarding internet use was for gaming behaviors. And there had been reports of deaths in internet cafes where people were gaming in marathon sessions, did not attend to their bodily needs and died. Other reports of parents leaving their children unattended while gaming and having the children pass. So it was felt that it was important to generate the diagnostic criteria, but they hadn't been sufficiently investigated. This also then left a bit of a deficit with respect to other internet use behaviors, as there not being a formal diagnostic entity for non-gaming, non-gambling types of behaviors, and I'll talk about that later. So if we think about internet use more generally, and problematic internet use as perhaps an umbrella term for a wide range of different types and patterns of internet use that all lead to interference in major areas of life functioning, are there some similar biological features that cut across problematic use of the internet? And that blunted reward processing that I had mentioned from fMRI studies seemed to hold for adolescents who demonstrated risky or problematic use of the internet, as shown as to how people processed at a brain level using EEG monetary rewards. So some other leading theories of the underpinnings of addictions, including substance addictions, are dual process models where there are strong motivational drives to engage in a behavior that are largely subcortically driven, and control over those drives that is exerted largely by cortical mechanisms. So in one study of internet gaming disorder, we wanted to examine the extent to which part of this model might hold with respect to executive control functioning in people with internet gaming disorder. So if we looked within an executive control network involving cortical brain regions, we found that the individuals with internet gaming disorder as compared to those without showed relatively decreased functional connectivity within an executive control network during resting state functional MRI. And moreover, the degree to which there was cohesion within this network or functionally integrated activation of this network was linked to out-of-the-magnet cognitive control as evidenced by performance of a neuropsychological task, the Stroop color word interference task, whereby the less cohesion, the less cognitive control. So fitting with this dual process model of addiction from the control perspective. Other data linking internet gaming disorder to substance use disorder come from a meta-analysis that we conducted on brain volumes, gray matter volumes, in individuals with and without internet gaming disorder. And in this meta-analysis, the individuals with internet gaming disorder showed, as demonstrated on the left by the blue color, smaller gray matter volumes within specific brain regions, including regions like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, as shown here. And those brain regions in the schematic from NIDA have been implicated in motivational drive and in inhibitory control, suggesting these overlaps between gaming disorder and substance use disorders. Now, based on models of substance use disorder and gambling disorder, we proposed now 10 years ago a model of internet gaming disorder that had some key elements with respect to decision-making, executive control, reward, stress relief motivations, and proposed that some different interventions like mindfulness-based stress reduction or cognitive behavioral therapy might target some of these core elements and use this as one framework for trying to understand whether some interventions that have been helpful for people with substance use disorders might be helpful for people with internet gaming disorder. So going from DSM-5 to ICD-11, there were questions that existed as to whether ICD-11 would harmonize with DSM-5 with respect to the renaming and reclassification of what was once termed pathological gambling, now gambling disorder, whether internet gaming disorder would be included or not, and whether hypersexual disorder, which was considered for DSM-5 but totally omitted from the manual, would be included in the ICD-11. So a group of us going back a decade began meeting on an annual basis in conjunction with the World Health Organization. And these meetings focused on internet use and behavioral addictions or disorders due to addictive behaviors, and asked the question as to whether internet use behaviors might be considered as the focus of new psychiatric conditions. So as we began to work on considering gaming and gaming disorder, there were debates in the literature. These are articles from 2017 where a group of individuals felt it was premature to include gaming disorder in the ICD-11, and a group of us felt that it would be important for diagnosis, management, and prevention efforts. Similarly, in the lay media, there were on back-to-back days articles that say game addict disorder is a moral panic, and then the National Health Services to open an addiction clinic for young online gamers to meet the clinical demand of people who were experiencing harms or pains related to excessive online gaming. When it was released that the ICD-11 might include gaming disorder, the gaming industry put out a statement against the proposition, stating that the evidence for the inclusion of gaming disorder in the ICD-11 remains highly contested and inconclusive, and that they urged the World Health Organization not to include gaming disorder in the ICD-11. So we, a group of us led by Daniel King, and has over 120 authors in the Gaming Industry Response Consortium, asked whether this might be a corporate strategy to disregard harm and deflect social responsibility. Remembering that it was only about 30 years ago that the executives of major tobacco organizations went in front of the U.S. Congress to testify that they did not believe that tobacco was an addictive product. So as there were these debates with respect to gaming, there were also similar debates with respect to compulsive sexual behaviors. So John Saunders and colleagues asked whether excessive gambling and gaming should be considered as addictive disorders in the ICD-11. A group of us asked whether excessive sexual behavior should also be considered in this context, and other authors wrote back saying that they did not believe that sex could be an addictive behavior. And then Shane Krause and colleagues led an article in World Psychiatry describing efforts of considering compulsive sexual behavior disorder in the ICD-11. And we reviewed the current data at the time for compulsive sexual behavior and problematic pornography use, and concluded that the existing data suggested that the classification of compulsive sexual behavior disorder might be best suited as a behavioral addiction rather than as an impulse control disorder. So what happened when the World Health Assembly met to adopt the ICD-11 in May of 2019? Gambling and gaming disorders were included as disorders due to addictive behaviors. Importantly, also hazardous gambling and hazardous gaming were included, and these are, I think, particularly relevant from a public health perspective, given that like for alcohol use, alcohol, the more extreme spectrum alcohol use disorders impact a smaller number of individuals who experience the most negative consequences, but a larger group of individuals experience hazardous or harmful alcohol use that makes the public health burden more substantial for this hazardous or harmful pattern of consumption. So having these defined entities of hazardous gambling and hazardous gaming may be particularly relevant from a public health perspective. And then compulsive sexual behavior disorder was included, but not as a disorder due to addictive behaviors, but rather as an impulse control disorder. And in some ways, this could reflect the evolution that occurred with gambling disorder, where it was initially classified as an impulse control disorder, and then later, as more data were accumulated, reclassified as a disorder due to addictive behaviors. But we need to see how this process plays out. Now, one might ask whether there's any relevance to the classification. If the condition is in the ICD-11, clinicians can use the diagnosis, so that is very relevant and I think is an important step forward. But in some jurisdictions, the ways in which the disorders are classified has direct clinical consequences, not only with respect to how people are trained to help other people with these conditions, but also there are sometimes governmental mandates. So, for example, in France, it was mandated that addiction centers provide care for people with any form of addiction. So this includes both substance addictions as well as behavioral addictions. So if a condition is classified as a disorder due to addictive behaviors or behavioral addiction, it will have direct clinical implications for who gets treatment in certain locations, at least in France. So in many ways, our worlds have changed with respect to digital technologies, and internet use has become more prevalent and more pervasive, and it has impacted the ways in which we engage in a wide range of behaviors. And so going back now 8 years, Matthias Brandt and colleagues proposed an interaction of person, affect, cognition, and execution model, or the IPACE model. That was in 2016. In 2019, we updated the model to include not only internet use disorders, but to other addictive behaviors, and to think about the progression as people go from experimenting with engagement in a behavior to developing compulsive or problematic or habitual use of in this case, the internet, but also other behaviors. So the IPACE model in its full initial form is shown here. It's published elsewhere. This is too small to read, so I'm going to focus in on this center aspect, and particularly think about how we looked at early stages versus later stages as behaviors became more compulsive or habitual in nature. So the center part, if we look at these early stages, we thought that events in the environment or internal feelings or emotions might serve as stimuli to generate affective and cognitive responses to these situations that then lead to decisions to behave in specific manners that are under inhibitory control. And then based on the outcomes, what people experience based on these decisions, there is gratification, particularly in the early stages, more so than compensation, that then leads to how people expect rewards out of similar situations in the future. So if we go to the later stages, those same external and internal triggers may lead more to cue reactivity and craving that lead to more habitual responses that are under less inhibitory control, and lead to more compensatory responses that lead to affective biases and coping strategies that people use in similar situations in the future. So So we thought that this would be a model for explaining how people transition from more goal-directed behavior to more habitual or compulsive behaviors. And these resonate with prior models, particularly Trevor Robbins and Barry Everett's models of substance addiction. And further, in the updated iPACE model, we provided more context for the environments as well as how people may react. And then importantly, the consequences with respect to the neural adaptations, the habitual and compulsive engagement, and a central feature of addictive disorders being this continued engagement despite the adverse consequences. So if we, some of the brain mechanisms that which we postulated, again, resonate with those in the substance use disorder literature, as well as in the behavioral addictions literature, which I'll describe. But the golden arrows are meant to reflect the more initial stages of engagement, where more ventral regions of the striatum are particularly relevant for rewarding and reinforcing behaviors, whereas in blue, the later stages are reflected where the dorsal striatum, which has been implicated in more habitual responses, was a key focus, and how these brain regions then interacted with corticostriatal thalamocortical systems is highlighted in the slide. So I'm going to shift gears a bit and ask how we can use not only these theories, but actual data to try to understand brain behavior relations that are relevant to addictive disorders. And this is a cover story from the American Journal of Psychiatry now about 5 years ago, where we used this approach called connectome-based predictive modeling to understand the brain mechanisms linked to cocaine abstinence. And connectome-based predictive modeling has been described as a neural fingerprinting, if you will, of trying to relate brain states to specific behaviors. So Sarah Yip took the lead on this project and used data from our Psychotherapy Development Center, where we integrated brain imaging measures into randomized clinical trials, including with respect to how people with cocaine use disorder improve over time. And what's shown is that these connectome-based predictive models performed well in terms of predicting cocaine abstinence, and that's also shown here, but it's hard to extract much meaningful information from these sorts of pictures besides the significant value in terms of the prediction. So these network maps, I think, are more meaningful, at least for me, where we can look at the positive network functional connectivity, the negative network functional connectivity, and look at how the canonical brain networks interact with one another to predict, in this case, cocaine abstinence. And so to break down these maps, there are more intense colors, for example, between the frontal parietal system and the medial frontal cortical system, as well as between the salience network and the motor sensory network, that show that there are particularly strong positive functional integrations between those networks that predict cocaine abstinence. Similarly, between network segregation may be highlighted in the more intense blue colors. So how can we take this information and then come up with a model that then predicts cocaine abstinence? That's shown here, where based on that map, we can look at between network integration and between network segregation to say that the model that predicts, the brain state that predicts cocaine abstinence involves the integration of the frontal parietal and medial frontal networks, as well as segregation between frontal parietal and sensory motor networks. So shifting gears a bit, in the United States, there has been an opioid epidemic for the past 10 to 20 years. And these are now the drug-involved overdose deaths over about a 20-25 year period. And one can see a substantial rise in drug overdose deaths. And these drug overdose deaths largely involve opioids, as one can see here, particularly over the course of a decade. One can see a rapid increase in terms of opioid deaths, largely for males as compared to females, but females also on the rise. And it was estimated that in 2021 in the United States, 45 people a day were dying from prescription opioid overdose. So with our psychotherapy development center data, we wanted to determine whether this cocaine abstinence network was the same that would predict opioid abstinence, or whether a different network would predict. And it was actually an independent network that was found to predict opioid abstinence as compared to cocaine abstinence, highlighting the need to understand from a brain behavior state and perhaps an intervention state, if we're going to use such approaches like neuromodulation, the specific disorders that are being targeted. So some of the details of this include what task data were used to identify the networks, and in the case of the cocaine abstinence, it was the reward processing data that could be used de novo to identify the network. In the case of opioid abstinence, it was a cognitive control task. But when we took those identified networks and then looked across the different types of task or resting state, if we took the cocaine abstinence network and then applied it to those other data, it fit, but it didn't fit if we took the opioid abstinence network. Similarly, if we took the opioid abstinence network and applied it to the reward-based data or the resting state data, it would fit, but not for looking at cocaine abstinence. So again, providing data that these are two distinct brain networks that are predicting cocaine versus opioid abstinence. Furthermore, to look at the robustness of the network, we did virtual lesioning of the networks and still found that if we lesion networks one by one, the resulting model remains significant, again, providing support for the robustness of the model. So we've used a similar approach to begin to look at other clinically relevant measures like craving. And in this study led by Kathleen Garrison, data were used across a variety of different diagnostic groups, individuals with cocaine use disorder, alcohol use disorder, people who are responding to craving to those cues, cocaine or alcohol, or other appetitive cues like favorite foods, and looking at the subjective craving responses. And we found that we could find neural fingerprints that predicted the craving responses, particularly for this neutral relaxing condition, suggesting that the brain state in a relative rest state may be predictive of subjective craving responses. So we also use data from a different type of task. The prior task was an audio tape task. This is a videotape task where individuals either with gambling disorder or cocaine use disorder reported craving responses to gambling or cocaine cues. And what we found was that we could generate a model that had these affective automatic components interacting with cognitive components in a specified way. And we were interested, since other groups, we and other groups have been using connectome-based predictive modeling to look at craving states. We wanted to see how robust across these studies was this model. And so what's shown here are 4 different studies that look at gambling, gaming, cocaine use, Katie's first authored study. And the more colors around the specific networks, the more highly these replicated across studies. And one can see that by looking at the studies, we see that there are some ways in which, for example, the default mode network interacts with the motor sensory network that interacts with subcortical brain regions that seem to cut across the studies using a variety of different diagnostic groups and a variety of different craving approaches. So this tends to suggest that there is a rigor and reproducibility to these findings, and the next step will be trying to take these data and see if we can use these data for improving interventions. So we've also looked at some transdiagnostic measures related to impulsivity, and I'll talk about the details of these findings in the next talk. But we've also used other approaches like intrinsic connectivity distribution, which looks at a voxel by voxel level in a whole brain corrected fashion, at the degree to which any one brain region is connected to other brain regions. And in this sample of close to 200 individuals, some with binge eating disorder, some with cocaine use disorder, some with gambling disorder, and some with none of those disorders, we found that the posterior cingulate cortex was implicated. And if we looked at the way in which this brain region connected to other brain regions, we found that the affected individuals differed from the control individuals with respect to posterior cingulate to bilateral posterior insula connectivity. Again, suggesting in this case a brain mechanism by which individuals with these conditions characterized by impaired impulse control differ from individuals without at a brain connectivity level. So, as I mentioned, this might have implications for neuromodulation, non-invasive neuromodulation, which has been approved for tobacco use disorder, but not for behavioral addictions. And some of the data that we have published suggests that stimulation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex results in better regulation of craving as well as better regulation of negative affect in individuals with internet gaming disorder. In a separate study, we looked at a craving behavioral intervention that was found then to decrease internet addiction scores, weekly gaming time, and craving for gaming in individuals with internet gaming disorder. We found that there were changes in cue-induced insula activation before and after treatment as compared to a waitlist control group. And if we look at that region of the brain in the insula and how it connected with other brain regions, we found that there were differences with respect to connectivity between the insula that is involved in interoceptive processes, how people experience feelings about how they are emotionally responding, and regions like the precuneus that have been implicated in craving, suggesting a brain mechanism for how the treatment might be helping people. We also collected resting state data and found differences before and after treatment with respect to connectivity between the orbital frontal cortex and the hippocampus, brain regions implicated in decision-making and memory, respectively, as well as the posterior cingulate cortex and premotor and motor regions, suggesting, again, another potential brain mechanism that could potentially be targeted in future studies. So we also explored an emotional association bias modification intervention for people with internet gaming disorder. What this involved was screening over 1,000 individuals to have 90 participants randomized, half of whom received the emotional association bias modification training and half who received sham training. And this involved, the active task involved linking pictures of gaming to negative words and pictures of non-gaming to positive words in a way to associate more positive feelings to non-gaming types of rewarding behaviors. What we found was that the active trial was active condition was superior to placebo with respect to reducing compulsive gaming behaviors and thoughts, and that from a brain-based level, there were changes with respect to dorsal striatal activations, and these were linked, if we use those brain regions and functional connectivity analyses in the gaming look condition of the task. There was relatively decreased cortical striatal connectivity. In the efforts to decrease responses, there was increased connectivity between the cortex and the dorsal striatum, and further the decreases in functional connectivity in the gaming look condition operated through decreases in gaming related compulsivity to lead to decreases in internet addiction severity related to gaming, suggesting a potential mechanism for these brain findings. So we've also looked at gender-related differences with respect to gaming cues before and after gaming. What we found was that males, as compared to females, showed more robust cue reactivity to the gaming cues. And this was linked to craving. It reached statistical significance in males as compared to females, but a similar pattern was shown in each. We've also tried to understand how some of these craving responses related to the emergence of internet gaming disorder in individuals who played video games recreationally. And so we scanned individuals, about 150 individuals. At one time, a year later, we reassessed them. 23 had developed internet gaming disorder, and we selected a matched group for comparison. The task involved imaging people with response to seeing these cues that are on the bottom, some of which had gaming, some of which did not, and then people engaged in a gaming experience in their favorite game, and they were recruited according to their gaming preferences. And then 20 minutes in, when people were in a battle scenario, typically the procedure was stopped and people were rescanned. And so what we found was that what was linked to the emergence of gaming disorder was this relatively increased striatal activity in this second period of scanning as compared to the first, which was not seen in the individuals who maintained their regular gaming behaviors. So this also raises questions about developmental considerations, as people like B.J. Casey and colleagues have argued that during adolescence, subcortical brain regions mature more rapidly than cortical brain regions. This may lead to adolescent risk behaviors. We've used similar tasks in adolescents who smoke and adults who non-smoke. The Stroop color word interference task, see relatively similar brain activation patterns. And what we see if we look at individuals with cocaine use disorder or adolescents with tobacco use disorder, we see some similarities in the brain activations that predict treatment outcome, particularly within the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, we also see changes over time with treatment in adults with substance use disorder, relatively decreased activation in specific cortical and subcortical brain regions that also seem to be observed in adolescents who smoke, and this is during a cognitive control task. In a reward processing task, we see the opposite, and if in the meta-analysis that I described earlier, people with addictive disorder show blunted activation. Here in the green, we show in this region of the striatum relative increase in reward-related activations following treatment, and we see this in other brain regions linked to reward processing. This may also have relevance to other disorders like adults with binge eating disorder who show this relatively blunted striatal activation. And this is also linked to treatment outcome in the individuals with binge eating disorder where this blunted striatal activation was linked to persistence in binging following treatment. So there are other brain regions and other approaches that we're using in that, for example, we have found a brain structural covariation pattern that in adults is linked to early initiation of alcohol use, is linked to high frequency screen media activity in children, 9 to 10-year-old children, in a manner that's linked to externalizing behaviors and subsequent internalizing behaviors. And we have an article coming out in the American Journal of Psychiatry that covers a broad range of clinical phenomena related to behavioral addictions. So in conclusion, I would say that there are significant overlaps between behavioral and substance addictions, that we have gained a lot of understanding of neurocognitive features, but we also have had, I would say, a gap in terms of there being a slowness in terms of translating this understanding into better prevention, policy, and treatment advances. So I'd like to thank a large number of individuals, funding agencies, and thank you for your attention. And I think that there is time for questions. And I'm not sure how the question and answer period works. Now some questions have popped up on screen. So I'll go in order that are here. So what steps can government, schools, and families take to prevent behavioral addictions before they develop? So I'll talk a bit about this in my next talk, but we have developed through a cost initiative, which is an EU initiative to target problematic usage of the internet. We have an e-booklet that one can download for free. It's available at www.internetandme.eu. And for schools and families, it has a number of tips, practical tips in terms of keeping digital devices out of the bedroom, introducing digital devices and their content in a age-appropriate manner, as well as providing modeling behavior about how one uses the internet oneself, and then providing guidance about ethical behavior and safe behavior on the internet. With respect to governments, I think that in many instances, governments are playing catch-up right now with how the internet is impacting individuals. Some of the different jurisdictions are taking different approaches. Some of this relates to how different jurisdictions come down on the side of balancing individual civil liberties as well as protecting the public health. So in some jurisdictions, there are more restrictive approaches. For example, in China, with respect to gaming, putting limits on the amount of time that youth can game. In Australia, there's been a bill over the last week or two restricting social media use by youth under the age of 16 years. And other jurisdictions, like in the EU, there have been some Privacy Act regulation that has been put into place for internet use companies like Meta, leading to large fines that have been levied against the company. So this is an ongoing process where I think different jurisdictions are taking different strategies to try to promote public health while ensuring civil liberties. So I see some reorganization of the ordering of the questions. So again, I'll go to the top. The neurostructures in the ventral prefrontal cortex and limbic system in gambling disorder are similar to antisocial personality disorder. Elaborate on effects of neuroplasticity on development of conduct disorder and APD, which I will take as antisocial personality disorder. So yes, there are data to link conduct and antisocial behaviors to some of the brain systems that I mentioned here. And some of the models, which I will discuss in this afternoon's talk, do speak of different roles, for example, or different pathways for developing behavioral addictions. So for example, Nauer and Blazinski's pathways model that was published over 20 years ago described an antisocial impulsive pathway for developing gambling disorder. And that tends to be more male in nature, which I will again describe later today. So thinking about these overlaps with respect to conduct and antisocial behaviors is something that is relevant. It can relate to some significant problems that youth experience and the relationship between externalizing concerns like conduct problems and internalizing concerns like mood and anxiety problems do appear to be linked in complex and nuanced ways. I think taking a step back, there are multiple considerations when people have behavioral addictions that need to be taken into account, and getting thorough clinical histories as well as considering the nuances with respect to co-occurring concerns is very important in targeting for the individual effective treatments. Do you think industries that might promote addictive behaviors, e.g. Gambling, social media, should be more regulated? I think that this is a concern that multiple governments are now facing. Some that I mentioned have taken different approaches, including within the EU. There have been other jurisdictions like Canada, which has put into effect a bill to limit the behaviors of specific many companies, including social media and pornography website companies, and this is being fought in the courts. So I think it's going to be important for us to see which interventions are going to be helpful in which jurisdictions. Where do you draw the line between an addiction and a compulsion like gaming or shopping? How can these distinctions guide treatment and diagnosis? So the different nomenclature systems have defined core elements of addiction. I think that in this talk, I've mentioned how the DSM considers aspects of withdrawal, tolerance, interference in major areas of life functioning, repeated unsuccessful attempts to cut back or quit, as well as the continued engagement despite adverse consequences. The World Health Organization and the ICD-11 has three main elements of impaired control, increasing priority given to the behavior such that it excludes other areas of life functioning, and then the continued engagement despite adverse consequences. And all of these have to occur over a significant period of time, typically for 12 months, but there's flexibility. And then there has to be functional impairment in one or more important domains of life functioning, as well as at times marked psychological distress, although people may be not experiencing that to uniform extents across cases. So in terms of how do we differentiate this disordered behavior, those are the core elements. There are also people who can engage in some behaviors like gambling or gaming while spending either sizable amounts of money gambling or significant proportions of time gaming, but not be experiencing the negative consequences for different reasons. So it sometimes becomes challenging to precisely draw the line, particularly based on quantity-frequency measures, between what is a recreational engagement in an enjoyable activity versus what is harmful or hazardous versus what is a disorder. And the criteria that the American Psychiatric Association and the World Health Organization have generated try to define these clearly so that people can make similar decisions about where individuals fall across different jurisdictions. So which areas of non-substance addictions are currently the most under-researched? I would argue that there are many areas that are under-researched. I didn't speak about compulsive shopping and buying disorder and behaviors. And we were talking about this over the past 24 hours about Black Friday and other big shopping extravaganzas. But that is an area that is particularly understudied. I would argue that problematic pornography use, particularly in developing youth, because there are data, for example, out of Poland that suggests that over one 5-year period as compared to the prior 5-year period, there's been a statistically significant increase in the proportion of 7 to 12-year-olds who are viewing pornography as compared to the prior 5-year period. And these are data from an internet provider, which can then, it's not self-report data, but it's internet-based data. And the extent to which youth are having their sexual arousal templates influenced by pornography, I think is very, can be very concerning and may, particularly given the the content of internet pornography and the ways in which algorithms operate. Talking with people in recovery from problematic pornography use, they describe it being kind of like going down a rabbit hole where if you watch one form of pornography, they say, well, you've liked this, why not try this? And people get directed to more extreme forms of pornography is what I hear. And then people can get into all sorts of trouble, not only with respect to the amount of time and how it interferes with things like work and school, but also with respect to the interrelationship problems. And there have been reports of young adult men who report erectile dysfunction that they attribute to having watched considerable amounts of pornography during their adolescence and having their sexual arousal templates be modified in such a way. There's also been rises in violent sexual behaviors, for example, choking during sex, that people have attributed to internet pornography, or at least it raises the question about these relationships. So these are all concerning areas that warrant more study. So the questions have disappeared. We are now concluding with the Q&A. So thank you for your attention and for your questions.